the newsagents.
Well, I want, and Keir wants, taxes on working people to be lower. And we certainly won't be increasing income tax or national insurance if we win the election.
So that's a clear commitment. You will not increase income tax?
No, we won't increase income tax or national insurance. In fact, we oppose the increases to national.
That was then Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves in May, before the general election. This was Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, this morning.
Did your manifesto rule out increasing any rate of national insurance, employers or employees, or was it merely talking about ruling out increasing the employees' rate?
We were very clear in the manifesto that we wouldn't be increasing tax on working people, and we expressly said that that was income tax, that was NICs, etc. So we set that out in the manifesto.
But NICs just for employees?
Well, it's very clear from the manifesto that what we were saying is we're not going to raise tax for working people. And it wasn't just the manifesto.
That phrase, working people, is doing an awful lot of heavy lifting in Keir Starmer's response. If he puts up the contributions that employers have to pay in national insurance, is it a breaking of the Labour manifesto? And if it is, will it hurt? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's Lewis.
It's Emily. And a little bit later, we will be talking to the self-styled kingmaker, Graham Brady, the man who essentially dispatched 5 prime ministers when the backbench Tory MPs decided they had had enough. His memoir's out, and having been the model of discretion for so long, he's Mr. Candor today.
But first, it is 2 weeks until the budget. A budget which is probably now the most trailed budget that we've had for many years. And this discussion, which really has emerged in the last sort of 5 days or so, about whether or not Labour will increase national insurance contributions for employers rather than employees, as Emily was saying, whether that breaks a manifesto pledge. This all comes back ultimately to the fact, something we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks, which is this is a government which is in desperate need of money. Yes, we know that Rachel Reeves is highly likely to tinker with the government's fiscal rules to reclassify what investment is in terms of whether that counts as debt or not. Something, by the way, she promised that she would not do before the general election. But that in itself still probably won't be enough, given the sort of fiscal black hole that they inherited from the Conservative government. And so one way to raise a lot of money really quickly would be to increase the amount of money that employers pay on national insurance contributions, which would be, it is said, about £17 billion. So we are talking about real money. The problem is that in the Labour manifesto, page 21, they said this: we will ensure taxes on working people are kept as low as possible. Labour will not increase taxes on working people, which is why we will not increase national insurance, the basic, higher or additional rate of income tax or VAT. So there is wiggle room, because you can say, well, what they meant by that is we wouldn't raise it on employees, not employers, but that is still pretty stark. We will not increase national insurance.
I'm slightly surprised that people have been so surprised by this, because if there was one thing that we kept on hearing when Labour was setting out their manifesto to come in the lead up to the general election, it was this emphasis on working people. And they never said a single phrase without adding in working people. And so I guess the only question really is how you define working people. And, I think, somebody has asked, is Simon Cowell a working person? Is Piers Morgan a working person? Of course, lots of people work very hard and they're also very rich. So they clearly didn't mean anyone who works. What they meant, I think you have to assume, is people who were on average incomes.
Although they never said that. I mean, they never ever said that.
They didn't, because the whole thing was meant to be working people. We're on the side of working people, right? We're on the side of, you're not going to say average incomes, but they're essentially saying these are the people that we're trying to protect, and we don't mind if those with broader shoulders have to carry a bit more of the load. And I guess, right, if you stand back and you say, what do Labour MPs, some of whom are, coming into government for the first time, think that this Labour Party is about? Is it about people with broader shoulders carrying the load? Of course it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Although at the same time, and this is what I think taking a step back from this, I think that that this is just a symptom of a wider problem, which was the complete vagueness that the government had going into the election. Because it is also a government which says, and we saw that at the Investment Summit yesterday, that we're all about growth.
Yeah.
Wealth creation is our number one priority. But what is, national insurance, governments love to increase national insurance because it has a really nice sounding title. But of course, all it is another tax on labour, on income. And ultimately, that is a tax on jobs, which is how that it's going to be perceived. And I think in terms of whether this is a problem for them in the manifesto, look, I think you can make a pretty strong argument that this is, at the very least, there is a good argument, a credible argument to say that it is a break of a manifesto pledge. Because ultimately, what is national insurance? It is a tax on working people. It's a tax on employing people. That's what it is. So it is quite literally, in many ways, a tax on working people. And in a way, whether you believe it is or not is kind of beside the point. It is certainly true to say that the Conservative Party, they are already getting their attack lines in on this. They are already sharpening it up and articulating it completely clearly as a manifesto pledge break. The Conservative press will be very sympathetic to that argument as well. Some businesses will be sympathetic to that argument. So Labour really needs a strong response to that. And the question is whether or not people care enough to become a big political problem for them. Because it is not, the one thing you can say is that what it is, employees will not notice it because it is a tax on employers. So it's not as if actually your average working person will notice it. But people are cynical enough out there, and there is such a sort of narrative out there about politicians breaking their promises, and that given there is already a narrative about Starmer and Reeves and so on being slippery, I do think it's potentially politically dangerous for them, actually.
I think vagueness was not a mistake, it was a strategy.
But it's a mistake now.
I was told by somebody very, let's call them a Labour grandee, that actually the one thing Keir Starmer needed to do to get elected was not to sit down and spell out everything he was about to do. Don't talk about whether you're going to extend the child tax credit, for more families of more than 2 children. Don't start spelling out winter fuel. Arguably, that was a mistake as soon as they came in. You have to keep things within the bounds of what you have intended, but without being too specific. And I think they're capitalising exactly on that form of words. And if you look at what it means in terms of the numbers now, the bulk of national insurance revenue comes from those employer contributions, right? About 63% of everything that they get from national insurance comes from employer contributions. So this is a massively easy way of closing, what we've told is the £22 billion, black hole in a way that doesn't affect most employees. What we need to hear, frankly, is whether employers will now say, that's put the kibosh on me employing anyone else, right? Am I not going to grow my workforce from 30 to 40 now?
Or increase wages. Yeah. Look, I think, you're absolutely right that the vagueness was deliberate, of course. And that worked for them going into the election because it meant that, they got all the barnacles off the boat, and it meant that the Conservatives found it very, very hard to pin them down on anything. But what I was thinking about this morning, it reminds me of a conversation that you and I sometimes have about when someone asks you, do you want to do something in 6 months' time? Like you want to do an event or something like that.
Yeah.
And
you say, if you wouldn't want to do it today, just say no.
Yeah, exactly. And then
I think Michael Gove is the original author of that.
Right, okay.
Bizarrely.
And it's like, and you agree to it, and you're like, well, that's a problem for future Lewis and future Emily to worry about.
I
right?
might be dead.
I might be, yeah, exactly. Who knows? That is very much the problem that Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have got themselves into. They backed themselves into a series of what some Labour MPs, if you talk to them now, said were unnecessary corners. Say, for example, on the fiscal rules, saying that they would stick to the fiscal rules, backing themselves into a series of, at the very least, weasel words around tax for electoral reasons. And the argument is that actually they had way more political space in the run-up to the election than they gave themselves credit for. Now, you can completely understand why you would get into that situation in the sense that you are, if you're the Labour Party, you're haunted by failure the whole time, and you think, we're going to lose, we're going to lose, we're going to lose.
And also, you talk about political space, Lewis, but actually that gap between Labour and the Tories closed quite substantially. He was looking at a 20-point poll lead, and it came down to 10 points in the end. And if you look at what happened to Theresa May, I think that's also the spectre. You can get rid of a 20-point lead very easily. So will they be saying that this is a better problem to have than the one where they were a little bit too honest with the electorate and everyone freaked? Yes. It's
a nice problem to have, but it is undoubtedly true to say that they have stored up problems for themselves as a result. And this is a symptom of that wider problem. It's also, look, the budget is going to be, in so many ways, a moment of proper definition for this government, perhaps the pivotal moment of definition, right? Because what it has been able to do, certainly up to the election, and up to some extent up to now, although it has had diminishing returns since they've got into government, is basically do that. Be vague, be all things to all people, not be too specific about what you're going to do. The budget is clearly a moment of definition. And it is a moment when trade-offs are going to have to happen, right? Because in so many ways up to now, the government has been able to say, yes, we want to be wealth creating and we're going to be pro-growth. But at the same time, as they're saying now, oh, well, maybe we'll increase taxes on national insurance, which is a tax on jobs. And that repeats itself in policy area after policy area after policy area. They will have to add definition and make choices, which by definition are going to displease people.
Yeah, but they can do something very concrete with this. They can spell out what it means. So if you increase national insurance for employers by 1%, you immediately raise £8 billion in 2 years' time. If you do it by 2%, you raise £17 billion. Now, I think if you were taking that to the electorate, I could be completely wrong about this, but if you're saying we've got a £22 billion black hole, we've shown it to you, it's terrible, you want us to spend more on the NHS and public services and all the rest of it, and we could, by a 2% increase, virtually wipe out that £22 billion.
But it's not the argument they've made up to now. I mean, that's the point.
No, I'm saying that's what they could make in the budget. At the point, I mean, we don't know. You know, what we've heard from Keir Starmer is him categorically ruling out, I think, a 39%. He was talking to Bloomberg yesterday. He said it will not be a 39%
capital gains rate.
So he's now starting to be in a place where, as you said, you know, several weeks ago, everyone's imagination has jumped ahead on this budget precisely because there hasn't been one till now. It's like waiting for darkness to come or waiting for a typhoon to hit. It's been so sort of big in the making that people have started letting their, you know, fears run away with them. So if you come back and you say, OK, we're going to spell out what that means, it's 1% and you get to take £8 billion off. It sounds pretty sensible.
Yeah, although, as I say, the point is that they have not been making those arguments up to now. They've been making arguments around fiscal probity. They've been making arguments saying they're not going to have to increase taxes.
I think if they did this with income tax, it would be a massive
would be a big problem. Well, and that would be an absolutely comprehensive, clear manifesto break. I think that the problem with the budget as well is that now because there has been such a run-up to it, there is such expectation being put upon it. If you talk to Labour MPs, that's something they're worried about. And I think there's going to be another kind of difficult narrative to try and sort of spin, or a sort of difficult circle to square on the budget as well, which is that on the one hand, it is clear now, we know, that the government is pivoting to this idea of borrowing to invest. They were talking about that again at the investment summit yesterday. Again, that is not something they were saying even just a couple of months ago when they were using a far more kind of George Osborne type agenda. Rachel Reeves was talking.
Although it was something they were talking about 2 years ago when they were talking about the 28 billion.
But exactly, that the oscillation has been significant, right? But yeah, even a few months ago they weren't talking about that. But now they are, and it does mean there's probably going to be tens of billions of pounds for capital investment available in a way that there might not have been a few months ago. So there's going to be money around. But on the day-to-day spending for government departments, on things like local government, on things like justice, on all of these areas of public services, Home Office, police, which have been struggling and which the public notice are struggling. I mean, I've been talking to officials and they say that some of the settlements, the budget settlements that are coming from the rounds of negotiation with the Treasury are eye-watering, are really difficult, really tight, because there will be money for capital investment, perhaps in things like the NHS, for new equipment, for schools, but also for infrastructure, stuff that will pay off and pay dividends in like 3, 4, 5, 6 years' time, maybe after the next election. But in terms of those kind of day-to-day things that people notice, actually, it will feel a lot more like austerity. So that will be a difficult message to try and calibrate, which is say there's more money, but there's also not as much money for certain things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not just stuff that will pay off, but stuff that will tell a story. And actually, the one thing that we've always said about Labour since they came to power was, apart from this kind of really weird first policy on winter fuel, which they kind of, you know, were out of the traps before everyone was, there hasn't been a story. There isn't the sense of setting your legacy. You know, I'm not saying we're back to the Victorian days where everywhere is going to have a brand new railway station, but at some point they do need to be able to say, this is what Labour stands for. Yeah. You know, we're going to get the infrastructure right. We're going to build this. We're going to sort out, you know, remember Boris Johnson going on about the 40 hospitals, and actually one of the best answers I think Keir's ever given in PMQs, certainly since he's been Prime Minister, was there weren't 40, they weren't new, and they were never funded. So get rid of
There
the
were never
old
hospitals, I think.
There were never hospitals. It was very easy for the Boris Johnson administration just to sort of make up and let people parrot it back at him. And I think, in a way, Keir Starmer hasn't done that up till now, which means that if they decide to say, this is borrowing to invest, we know it's going to be really hard, but you're also making your case a little bit for saying, well, yeah, you do have to put taxes up then, somewhere. And in a moment, we will be speaking to Graham Brady, formerly Sir Graham, now Lord Graham Brady, who was for 14 years the chairman of the Conservative backbenchers 1922 committee, the man who essentially dispatched Tory prime ministers when their time was over.
This whole affair is inexcusable. It is a pitiful reflection on the Conservative Parliamentary Party at every level. This is an absolute disgrace. As a Tory MP of 17 years, who's never been a minister, who's got on with it loyally most of the time, I think it's a shambles and a disgrace. I think it is utterly appalling.
That was a voice you might remember. It was Charles Walker, the former Conservative MP in the days before Liz Truss made her inevitable departure from the stage. And his good friend, Graham Brady, is with us here today. He's just published his memoir, Kingmaker. And Graham was head for 14 years of the 1922 committee, which, in a sense, had the, I don't know whether we'd say enviable or unenviable job of telling prime ministers when their time was up. Somewhere between gravedigger, executioner, dispatcher. Just explain that role for us, Graham.
Well, maybe a little bit of all of those. I was just enjoying listening to Charles Walker, who was my vice chairman for 11 years of those 14. And
did you ever wish that you could do what he did, just sort of burst out and say exactly what you were thinking?
I think Charles and I complemented each other perfectly, in that I would keep everything calm, and Charles would release a little bit of tension and pressure. But we worked together very, very well, and he was a great colleague. But just explain the mathematics, because your job was basically to receive letters from individual MPs. You never revealed how many you had. You never revealed who'd sent them. And when that number of letters reached a threshold... Yes, 15% of the parliamentary party writing letters to the chairman of the 1922 committee asking for a vote of confidence to take place. Then it was incumbent on me to ensure that such a vote was organised.
And you would have to sneak along somehow to Downing Street to have an audience with the Prime Minister. As it turned out, you did it 3 times?
Yes. I prefer to think that I wasn't sneaking. I was just trying to be discreet. But it is one of the odd things about our constitutional arrangements in this country that unless you've got a ministerial car, you can't get from the Palace of Westminster to number 10 Downing Street without being in public at some point. So I did experience these numerous occasions where there was intense media interest in where I was walking, in which
because
direction.
As soon as people saw you, they realised something was up. Something was going
they
on.
either realised something was up or they imagined it was.
And you've been a model of discretion all the way through. But it sort of sounds, when you read the book, that you're, to coin a phrase, unleashed, that you actually are much more candid now. And you get the sense that you didn't much like any of them.
It's not really about whether you like them or not. I guess the book is based on contemporaneous diary notes. So some of the episodes I'd said at the time when I made my note how I felt at the time. And so there are certainly times when in the heat of the moment you might be a little bit harsh in a judgment. But actually I try in the book to be fair and give a more rounded judgment. So it was no surprise people knew that I'd had a difficult start in my relationship with David Cameron. But I do also say that David Cameron said he wanted to be Prime Minister because he thought he'd be rather good at it. And on the whole, he was. I try to be fair.
Who did you enjoy the best personal relationship with?
Rishi Sunak. And I always thought it was odd My experience was completely different from the received wisdom that was, oh, he's far too wealthy, he can't possibly relate to ordinary people. I found Rishi very human, very natural, and almost a complete absence of ego, which is, as you know, a rare commodity in a politician.
Did you enjoy this job? And if I could put it, did you occasionally perhaps enjoy it a little bit too much?
No, I don't think so. I enjoyed it when I thought I was able to contribute something by doing a job well. Yeah. I guess reaching the point in particular in relation to the famous letters calling for votes of confidence.
But you've got so much attention in these years. You know, people like us. I mean, I've followed you around College Green like the rest of the press pack. You got so much more attention than perhaps some of your predecessors did.
I got more attention than most cabinet ministers did. But the great thing about it was the less I said, the more attention I got. And so it's something I would recommend to politicians. Sometimes, you won't like me saying this, but sometimes not saying things and refusing the invitation to open up on the media actually makes people more interested in what you've got to say.
Did you enjoy that attention?
Some of the time. Sometimes, inevitably, it's quite irritating. It's certainly irritating if you get cameras outside the gates of the flats where you're living and so on. I think I lived with it for quite a long time. Obviously, there were times when it was more intense than others.
In the end, it felt like you wore the coat of the Tory party undertaker, or executioner, perhaps, that you dispatched prime ministers.
Well, I think actually they dispatched themselves, with the exception, obviously, of Rishi Sunak, who was dispatched by the electorate. In all of the other instances, David Cameron chose to walk away the day after the referendum on EU membership. Theresa May resigned, having won a vote of no confidence, but not that comfortably, but having reached a point where she simply couldn't make the departure from the EU happen, which was the kind of core function of her government. Boris Johnson ended up resigning under the circumstances following the Chris Pincher case.
Well, I guess under the fact that so many of his cabinet and colleagues resigned, right? Didn't want to work for him.
It had just become impossible for him to form an administration. And Liz Truss obviously was there for a very brief period, and then again she resigned. And in some ways that was the easiest of the conversations I had, because when I went to see her, she'd already arrived at exactly the same conclusion
you said
that I had.
In your book she looked relieved
Yes.
when you said it was unsustainable.
Yes, and clearly she'd been under intense pressure for, albeit that very short premiership.
You were the morphine.
I'm not sure about that, but at least at that moment, I guess it was. I mean, she said, "How bad do you think it is?" I said, "I think it's very bad." She said, "I agree." She said, "Do you think it's retrievable?" I said, "I'm afraid I don't think it is."
Just out of interest, Graham, what would you have said to her if she had said,
It's
I'm
great.
gonna keep on"? How would you have reacted in that situation, knowing what you did?
I would have said that I thought it was unsustainable. At a previous meeting, a few days, perhaps a week before, she was very determined to carry on. And at that point, I'd suggested that the parliamentary party essentially was in three broadly equal groups: those who wanted her to go straight away, those who wanted her to go once they'd decided who should replace her, and those who are institutionally loyal to whoever is the prime minister at the time, and that it would be unsustainable at the point that the middle group joined the first. And she suggested that actually it might all work in the other direction, and she'd persuade people to renew their support for her.
She suggests now, of course, that she was the victim of an institutional plot. What do you say to that?
Well, I couldn't see an institutional plot at the time. I mean, I think there were some questions about how certain markets behaved, which I think was largely unexpected by quite a lot of people. There, of course, are questions about how exactly the Bank of England responded to the mini budget and the fallout from the mini budget. But I think more fundamentally, we watched both the mini budget and how that went wrong, and then, and again, these are remarkable instances where you see something you would never ever believe could bring a Prime Minister down, being the immediate catalyst that does so. And in this instance, it was the vote over a non-binding Opposition Day debate relating to fracking.
So mishandled by the whips of the day.
It was very odd, and I'd seen Liz Truss earlier that day, and I'd said I didn't think it was wise to make the fracking vote a vote of confidence, where the whip would be removed from any Conservative who voted with the Labour Party on that motion, because I thought she was at a point where a significant number might still do it, and it could have led to her being in a weaker position rather than a stronger one. By the time the vote came, the minister who was on his feet in the chamber had confirmed to a colleague by an intervention that the vote would not be treated as a matter of confidence. But of course nobody had told the chief whip or the deputy chief whip, who then both resigned. It was the most remarkable scene of chaos I've seen in 27 years in the House of Commons.
If we go back earlier, you describe the moment that you thought Theresa May was in trouble when you got a text or a note from Boris Johnson asking to come to see you. And he uses the phrase, if it isn't inappropriate. This was October of 2018. Was it inappropriate?
No, I think it
the idea presumably was he wanted to know if she was about to fall so that he could creep in behind her, or push her.
So it would have been inappropriate if I was going to answer any questions about how many letters have been submitted asking for a vote of confidence or whatever. Nothing inappropriate, and as far as I could see, in any colleague coming to see me to talk.
But what did you read from that meeting? I mean, was he asking you whether she was vulnerable to a push?
I suspect that he was hoping to get more out of me than he did.
I wonder if there isn't a contradiction at the heart of your role, Graham. In one sense, you are the arbiter. You know, it's beautifully impartial. You count the letters. You're the calculator. On the other hand, you do have clear political views. You know, for example, you brought your own amendment to Theresa May's withdrawal agreement, the Brady Amendment. To some extent, that must compromise you, because you have this incredible inside track to the Prime Ministers when they ask you how things are going. I mean, it's possible for you to say, not very well, if you don't like their withdrawal agreement.
Well, indeed. But first of all, the Brady Amendment to the withdrawal agreement was an attempt to help the Prime Minister.
Did she see it that way?
Well, she did, by the point that she told the Conservative Party to vote for it. So it went through with the support of the government. But as I relate in the book, the Chief Whip and I have been working quite closely together for some time to try to find a way to get us out of the stasis that had afflicted Parliament for so long.
But you didn't like the backstop. You didn't like her withdrawal agreement. And I wonder if that influences the advice that you end up giving to a Prime Minister.
Well, what I always tried to do when there was a divergence between my view and what I thought was the majority view of the parliamentary party was simply to say so in terms. So there were times when I would say to a Prime Minister, look, I think you're doing exactly the wrong thing on this, and I have very strong views on it, but don't worry, I think 80% of the colleagues are firmly behind you.
Of all the many conversations you had, Graham, with Prime Ministers or leaders of your party, which was the most difficult?
I would say the most difficult conversations were with Theresa May when she was going to have to leave office, because the essential dilemma was that whilst most colleagues had decided her position was untenable, there was a very significant number of us who wanted to try to ensure that she could go with some dignity rather than yielding to the pressure to change the rules to allow another confidence vote, which would have been brutal.
Talking about changing the rules and sort of bringing you to where we are now, William Hague said a couple of weeks ago that he made a mistake back in 2001 by giving the Tory leadership role vote to Conservative Party members. Is he right? Would it be better without members voting?
I've always said that I think when the party is in government, it makes sense for the parliamentary party to make the decision. And essentially that's about the alignment of the people who select the leader and the people who can get rid of a leader when they don't have confidence in him or her. So I think that makes sense. The trouble is, what William also did was put in place a constitution which requires, I think it's 2/3 of each part of an electoral college to change it. So you would need a significant majority of the people representing the party members to support taking that final vote away.
So
from
he
the
really
party
screwed it up all ways.
well, I think William has said himself that he thinks it was a mistake.
It does create a problem, doesn't it, potentially? Because as we saw, it happened with the Labour Party as well. It's not just
Absolutely.
that you can have a problem if members are selecting, and we have a parliamentary system, and they don't have MP support. That's just a recipe for instability, isn't it?
Yes, and if, as happened with Jeremy Corbyn when the Parliamentary Labour Party voted no confidence, but the members sent him back.
You think it would be better altogether? I mean, in some hypothetical world, we could do it. That it would be better to return to the old system for both parties, where the Parliamentary Labour Party, the Parliamentary Conservative Party choose the leader.
Yeah.
I think that makes sense. So people who know the individuals best, and are ultimately the people who have the capacity to remove a leader from office.
Although capacity is an interesting one to use in the wake of what happened last week with the Tory leadership race within the parliamentary party. I mean, that was a fiasco, wasn't it?
It depends what happened, and nobody knows.
Well, should it stop being a secret ballot?
I don't have any difficulty with the secret ballot. We obviously do expect members nominating somebody to be public in it. It would be possible to say that, if you had a longer list of people nominating, that they would all have to be public. Obviously, this isn't a matter for me now; it's a matter for my successor.
No, but what do you
Bob
think?
Blackman.
I mean, when you look at what happened last week, you've been trying to read the runes a bit, haven't you?
Well, I think part of the problem, though, is with such a small parliamentary party, a very, very small movement of votes can make
but
a huge difference.
they could all do the maths. I mean, they all knew how many people were there before they started sort of ferreting around and trying to game the system, didn't they?
I think it is possible that people were trying to game the system. It's also possible that it was people changing their mind, coming to a different conclusion. There were quite a lot of colleagues, I think, who never declared for any particular candidate. But I think we've got two good candidates in the
Who are you
final.
supporting?
I'm supporting Kemi. I've known Kemi for a long time, and I think she has an authenticity which is appealing. And I think that's something that the voting public is very keen to see, is authenticity in politicians.
What do you make of the argument that she is too combustible, that she believes in many things, as you say, that no one would perhaps doubt that, but that she starts fights unnecessarily, perhaps even with herself?
Well, I think that there is the balance, and it's the appeal as well. Is the, as I say, authenticity, real conviction, belief, and I would also add that if she's successful in this election, then she's probably got nearly 5 years as leader of the opposition.
Do you think she'll last for 5 years? Given what we know about Conservative leadership contests,
I think the circumstances of the last few years have been remarkable, which led to that very unusually rapid turnover of leaders. And if you go through each in turn, you can see there were reasons why each happened in the circumstances which applied. I think in these circumstances it's important we choose a leader with a very strong intention that they serve for 5 years and then win the next election.
Do you think they should change the 15% threshold? Because that means you only need, fewer than 20 MPs to create a challenge?
Personally, I think it's an academic question. And one of the serious things in the book, and there are one or two things I put in there just to try to make it a good read so that people enjoy it. But one of the things that I wanted to get on the record was not revealing the identity of colleagues who wrote asking for a confidence vote, but giving the timeline of how those letters came in. And so one of the things that I think people can draw from that is that actually it was always very, very difficult to reach that 15% threshold. And
because letters can be taken out as well as put in.
They can be taken out as well as put in. So you had instances such as the early months of 2022 when
war,
Partygate was going on, letters were coming in sharply, then people withdrew them because there was a war going on. And then it started to build again.
But Bob Blackman said it should go up to 30%, so you disagree with that?
Personally, I don't think it makes that much difference. I think that if you had a higher threshold, in the circumstances where there is a groundswell of opinion thinking there's a problem, you'll reach the higher threshold. But the important thing, I think, to note is that colleagues were always very, very reluctant to start that process.
You have been the keep calm and carry on voice, a sort of voice of sanity. And yet, if you step back and you say, hang on, you've been in that job 14 years and you've seen 5 prime ministers. It's not actually a great track record, Graham. It's there is something perhaps that unites you to this chaos.
Well, I don't know. I think I did what I could to try to advise those prime ministers in a way that might have helped to extend their period in office. I then tried to make sure we had an efficient process for replacing them when they went.
So do you think you are a kingmaker in that sense? I mean, that's the title of the book.
The title of the book was supplied by a security guard who called me that as I was going in through one of the entrances to the Palace of Westminster, and I'm very grateful to him. I wish I knew his name and I could thank him personally.
I'm sure he's listening. He's listening.
I hope he is. But no, I think that there have been times when in the role that I was performing, it was possible to help to hold things together.
I mean, are you saying it would have been even more chaotic? Because most people in this country cannot imagine that. They just can't imagine that.
I think the turnover of prime ministers was largely the product of particularly trying and very pressurised circumstances. And with the exception
Brexit.
With the exception of David Cameron, who I was live on BBC television saying how important it was he should remain Prime Minister at the exact moment that I saw on the monitor opposite. He walked out of the door at number 10 and Cameron resigns appeared on the screen. Yeah. But if you then move forward through Theresa May, who, having had that 2017 election, didn't have the majority to deliver what she needed to deliver, it became an literally impossible situation. We then had Boris Johnson, and as I say in the book, that I think that the fact that he created that extraordinarily complex series of restrictions that a lot of people were struggling to follow from
Just
day
on
to
that
day.
note, when you asked him to go, or when you told him that you thought it was untenable that he stay, he suggested calling a general election.
I think that was when he was facing the confidence vote.
What was your response to that? A man who thinks that he is presidential, essentially.
I thought it would have been very unwise to call that general election. I think that certainly Boris did think that the 80-seat majority was very much a personal mandate. I think that Boris deserves an enormous amount of credit for that majority, and so does Jeremy Corbyn.
Graham Brady, thank you very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Before we go, as we record today, Tuesday, it is exactly 3 weeks until Americans go to the polls for those voting on polling day in the US presidential election. The polls are incredibly close. This will be one of the tightest fought elections for, we think, many years. And in tomorrow's episode of the Newsagents USA, we're going to be asking how much of a factor race is playing in the race. And we'd also like some of your questions for the weeks ahead. If there are questions about how the voting takes place, or what you think is driving the election, or things that you don't understand about the process, we'll tackle them head on. We'd love to hear from you on our email, or a little voice note is always welcome as well. Newsagents@global.com, and John Sopel is back from his Caribbean tour tomorrow. Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.